Today's talk will explore the origins of the Cold War. This includes the British and Allied occupation of Germany at the end of the Second World War, the formation of NATO, and the eventual division of Europe between East and West. The Cold War is conventionally seen as a conflict between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Today, however, I will be focusing on the important, albeit often overlooked, role of Britain and the British Army in this history. Ultimately, this lecture intends to provide some instructive context for a complex and fast-changing moment in the history of modern Europe. I also hope it might offer a few novel answers to those perennial questions of why these events are relevant to Britain and still matter to this day. With that said, a quick glance at the news in recent years is perhaps enough for the history of the Cold War to feel relevant once more. Let's begin in February 1945, during the final months of the Second World War, and just weeks before the first Allied troops entered German territory. At that point, the three leaders of Britain, America, and the Soviet Union met at the Levadia Palace in the Crimean city of Yalta. The palace, which had only 9 functioning toilets, was hardly suited to the demands of a major international conference. Over the 8 days of the meeting, delegates made endless complaints, not only about long queues for the bathroom, but also infestations of bed bugs and swarms of mosquitoes. If we had spent 10 years on research, we could have not found a worse place in the world, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill complained to American policy advisor Harry Hopkins. Nevertheless, the leaders of the Allies, often known as the Big Three, managed to solve some of the outstanding territorial disputes relating to Germany. Agreement on the issue of Germany's future borders followed on from the notorious Percentages Agreement of October 1944, a secret and informal pact initially penned on the back of a napkin between Churchill and the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. This had established a consensus for the division of power in Europe between the war's victors. Greece was, for instance, to be 90% under British and American influence, while Bulgaria was to be 75 to 80% under the influence of the Soviet Union. In an instant, the fortunes of millions of people were divvied up between East and West. Most significantly, Poland's borders would be radically altered. The Soviet Union would be allowed to retain eastern areas annexed in 1939, and the Polish state was to be compensated with what had been German land to the west. Crucially, it was also at Yalta that detailed plans for post-war Germany finally began to take shape, including the proposal for a military occupation. This means that German territory was to be put under the temporary military control of Britain, America, France, and the Soviet Union. But unlike with annexation or colonialism, it was anticipated that at some point the German people would be allowed to take back control of their own affairs, once the war's victors had deemed the country sufficiently cleansed of Nazism and, crucially, no longer a military threat. A few months later, following the end of the war in Europe, the plans for what to do with Germany were finalized at the Potsdam Conference in July 1945. At Potsdam, the leaders of Britain, America, and the Soviet Union confirmed their intention to take a hardline approach to Germany. During the military occupation, the Allies would each implement a course of far-reaching reform intended to radically alter Germany's social, economic, and political structure from the top down. The day-to-day reality of this undertaking would be very complicated, as the occupiers took on responsibility for everything from schools to the restitution of stolen art. But their efforts focused around 4 overarching objectives, the so-called 4 Ds of demilitarization, denazification, deindustrialization, and democratization. In order to accomplish this, they would establish a military government in Germany. It was directed from Berlin, where an Allied Control Council was set to act as a kind of national government responsible for important matters affecting Germany as a whole, with decisions requiring unanimous assent. But Germany was to be split into 4 zones, with the Soviet Union, Britain, America, and France each governing independently in their own occupation zone, with total control over all areas of state and society. Likewise, Berlin, though located deep inside the Soviet zone, would be split between the 4 occupiers, with each sector ruled independently. Britain's occupation zone would be staffed by a combination of soldiers, a formation known as the British Army of the Rhine, and civilian administrators, known as the Control Commission for Germany. It was, according to Field Marshal Montgomery, the first military governor of the British zone, one of history's boldest experiments. In the summer of 1945, Britain's military and civilian occupiers set about their work. For some, this meant the dangerous but unavoidable task of clearing the zone of tank carcasses, unexploded bombs, and all kinds of weaponry, demilitarization. Although members of the Army of Occupation set about trying to track down and bring Nazis to justice, alongside a series of war crimes trials, denazification involved British administrators handing out the so-called Fragebogen, a questionnaire comprising 131 separate questions intended to classify an individual's allegiance to Nazism. The form asked respondents for their name, date of birth, hair colour, and other such particulars, as well as an array of more detailed queries ranging from which church do you belong to have you ever been a member of the General Staff Corps. The completed questionnaires are assessed by denazification panels and review boards, with those suspected of complicity with the Nazi regime classified and penalised accordingly. Others whose answers demonstrated a sufficiently clean record received a certificate, colloquially nicknamed the Persilschein or Persil ticket after the popular detergent. This was needed for taking up work in a large variety of professions, from the civil service to teaching. The occupiers also set in motion long-term plans for the reconstruction of a devastated country. This, of course, included clearing streets of rubble and rebuilding infrastructure, but from the off there was also a heightened concern with the mind of the German people. Accordingly, the occupiers set upon a program of re-education intended to impress the values of democracy and peace upon the German people. At the end of the war, the Allies closed down all radio stations and newspapers, with the Control Commission licensing and censoring a new era of German media. When it came to schools, in the first couple of years, the primary focus would be pragmatic, purging Nazi-era textbooks and politically compromised teaching staff while getting classrooms up and running once again. But ambitious plans for radically restructuring the entire sector, rewriting German curricula, and creating new teacher training programs were also on the agenda. This was all part of a long-term plan for the democratization of Germany. When it came to the German economy, plans were more about destruction than reconstruction. The British and their allies implemented harsh economic measures, seen as a vital component of nullifying Germany's means of making war in the future. In essence, the Allies would seek to severely restrict the German economy, closing down factories and even whole industries in the hope of stopping any future war production. At the same time, major banks and large companies were broken up, with surviving machinery dismantled and confiscated by the Allies as reparations. After years of uncertainty, the Allies had at long last agreed a plan for post-war Germany. British soldiers and civilians took charge of the British zone in the northwest of the country. They had near total responsibility for a vast area of territory, around 39,000 square miles, and for the more than 20 million Germans who lived there. They hoped to build a new democratic Germany out of the ruins of Hitler's Third Reich, but everyone agreed this would probably take years or even decades to accomplish. As one British official would later state, this was an enterprise of great magnitude and difficulty for which there was no precedent in human history. The challenges facing Britain's military occupation of Germany were enormous, not least for the millions of Germans who now lived under British rule. The scale of destruction was incredible. In Hamburg alone, there were an estimated 35.8 million cubic meters of rubble, said to be enough to fill a train of freight cars as long as the Earth's circumference. Across the city, 54% of all buildings were damaged or destroyed. This level of devastation inevitably impacted all aspects of life. For one, there was a critical shortage of housing. Huge British and American air raids had damaged 79.5% of available stock, with almost 50% totally destroyed. The same was true of municipal buildings. Of the 451 schools which had stood in 1938, only 60 remained operational. In a city of 100,000 school-aged children, the strain was unimaginable. Likewise, around 40% of medical buildings had been rendered unusable, and this was a story repeated in towns and cities across the zone. Communication lines, electricity, water and sewage networks, urban infrastructure, and above all housing were in a terrible state. The war had also devastated much of the continent's agricultural production and trade infrastructure, creating a worldwide food shortage to which the British zone was particularly vulnerable. Historically, the region under British control had relied upon food imports from other parts of Germany. Now, at the Potsdam Conference, British negotiators had emphasised the necessity of treating Germany as a single economic unit, whereby industrial output from one zone, e.g. the British, could be exchanged for food for another, most likely the Soviets. But in the end, there was no clear hierarchy of priorities among the various provisions of the agreement. The Soviets, whose wartime losses were unparalleled, took reparations as the principal concern and demanded an allocation of $10 billion worth of reparations in kind, ranging from machineries to vehicles and ships, prior to allowing any trade of food from their own zone. In other words, while goods and industrial products went from the British, French and American zones to the Soviet zone, there was no exchange of foodstuffs in the other direction as had been anticipated. As a result, most Germans in the British zone went hungry. Many soon found that securing basic necessities, food, shelter, and fuel for fires, defined the rhythm of everyday life. Widespread homelessness, hunger, and inadequate supplies of clothing threatened to bring famine and disease. These potentially devastating shortages of just about everything were further exacerbated by the arrival of some 3 million newly released prisoners of war. At the same time, liberated concentration camp inmates, former forced labourers, and other so-called displaced persons roamed the British zone in search of food, shelter, retribution, or simply a route home, if there still was a home. Added to the growing humanitarian emergency was one of the gravest refugee crises in history. Since the autumn of 1944, as Soviet troops advanced towards eastern parts of what was then German territory, large swathes of locals fled west. By the end of the war, several million Germans, among them wartime evacuees, recent settlers, and so-called ethnic Germans, had been displaced from Eastern Europe. Then, in line with territorial agreements made at Potsdam, the Soviets and their allies enacted a huge population transfer of the remaining Germans in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. In the shadow of the brutal Nazi occupations of Eastern Europe, violence and reprisals were commonplace. A huge number of these refugees would eventually make their way to the British zone. This mass relocation of people on such a scale inevitably touched upon almost every aspect of the military occupation, intensifying already existing shortages of shelter, transportation, clothing, and of course, food. Across the zone, infant mortality rose sharply. Workplace absenteeism shot up as German workers scavenged the countryside in the hope of finding something to eat. The black market grew hugely as the German people traded cigarettes or their remaining belongings with Allied soldiers in exchange for food and other basic supplies. Soon, local currency was more or less worthless. For British soldiers, the sight of young children waiting expectantly outside of bases for scraps of discarded food soon became commonplace. Many opted to give up their own rations to help those so obviously in need. Mick Morris Metcalf, who was serving with the Royal Military Police, was forced to explain to his superiors that he had given away his rations to children in Bad Salzuflen. "Well, we'll be bloody hungry," replied his captain. "We gave ours too." But individual initiative was never going to be enough. In early 1946, the British government was forced into urgent action, and shipments of food from North America intended for Britain were hurriedly redirected to the British zone of Germany. It was a close-run thing, but it proved just enough to stave off a full-blown famine that winter. Yet any relief from the disaster had been averted was short-lived. For one, the situation remained stark, with thousands of Germans dangerously malnourished and millions of others living on the breadline. As many commentators pointed out, it was worryingly reminiscent of the conditions which had brought the Nazis to power originally in the 1930s. Meanwhile, the British found themselves in a tricky position. They were now entirely dependent upon food imports to maintain even a meagre ration in the zone. The costs of these imports were met from Britain's dwindling supply of US dollars and represented what many felt was an untenable financial burden. It was an imposition that Chancellor of the Exchequer Hugh Dalton openly resented during his budget speech in April 1946. "I am quite sure," he said, "that the British taxpayer cannot and should not much longer be expected to go on paying on this scale what are in effect reparations to Germany." Almost immediately, there was a direct impact upon the British public too. In July 1946, the Ministry of Food was forced to announce the introduction of bread rationing across the country, something that had been avoided during both World Wars. Despite the ethical desirability and practical necessity of the policy, the news was greeted with widespread outrage. According to the Daily Mail, bread rationing was the most hated measure ever to have been presented to the people of this country. This, coupled with this growing discontent amongst the British public over the apparent failings of British soldiers and civilian administrators stationed in Germany, from drunken escapades to illicit love affairs with the locals, many were beginning to question what Britain was achieving in post-war Europe beyond embarrassment, and all at a huge financial cost. It was an unsustainable situation, with the growing financial costs of occupying Germany threatening Britain's position as a world power. Yet the British government were all too aware of the need to maintain their position in Germany. For one, there were the obvious humanitarian concerns which had linked to more pragmatic considerations. The cost of allowing the situation in Germany to spiral out of control, whether it be a new brand of fascism or simply the spread of actual disease, could not be tolerated. There were also growing ideological interests. In the spring of 1946, numerous Communist Party candidates were voted onto works councils in the British zone of Germany, prompting fears in London that German workers might embrace communism over liberal democracy. It was symptomatic of the terrible conditions that most Germans experienced in those years. And as Deputy Governor of the American zone, Lucius Clay, famously remarked, there was no choice between being a communist on 1,500 calories a day or a believer in democracy on 1,000. The British government knew that only a balanced German economy, functioning as a single economic unit, and thereby allowing foodstuff to be imported from the Soviet zone of Germany, could minimize Britain's expenditure. But as relations with the Soviet Union worsened, this outcome seemed increasingly unlikely. The British government now began to consider plans for an alternative approach to Germany, breaking away from the stipulations made at Potsdam and ending Britain's precarious wartime alliance with the Soviet Union. The danger of the Soviets, Britain's strongly anti-communist Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin suggested, had become as great as, or possibly even greater than, that of a revived Germany. In the spring of 1946, Bevin proposed the Western option, a policy proposal which aimed to cover the costs of importing food from North America. This would be achieved through increasing the amount of goods produced in the British zone of Germany, selling them on the international market to raise funds for these food imports. In other words, Bevin proposed rebuilding German industry and in turn transferring power back to the Germans much sooner than anyone had anticipated at the end of the Second World War. In the summer of 1946, British policymakers reached something of a consensus, privately accepting the need for this new approach in Germany. It then became a question of diplomacy, as Bevin led the charge in bringing the Americans on board. In July, at the Paris Conference of Foreign Ministers, he openly declared Britain's intention to organise their own zone in such a manner that no further liability shall fall upon the British taxpayer. A few weeks later, the US authorities declared their intention to adopt these new policies for Germany. In hindsight, we can see that Bevin's Western option was the starting gun of a conflict between East and West that would consume Europe for the next 40 years. This was, in other words, the beginning of the Cold War. In 1947, a gradual handover of power back into German hands began in the British and American zones, and the two territories were now joined together to form a single entity known as the Bi-Zone. This included responsibility for law and order, local government, education policy, elections and public health, and even denazification. There were also significant changes in the economic management of the zone aimed at restarting industrial production. Across the board, the British and Americans had less power. As one British officer, Edward Rich, remarked, where previously we have ordered the Germans to do this or not do that, now we had to advise them what to do. The creation of the Bi-Zone marked the beginning of a strategy of containment as Britain and America sought to halt any potential spread of Soviet communism to Western Germany or beyond. It was a policy that would soon see Germany divided between East and West. In February 1947, the Soviet representative at the Control Council in Berlin voiced his country's distrust of the fusion between the British and American zones. They considered this to be a short-sighted, unilateral break from the common policies agreed in 1945 and a blatant attempt to utilize Germany for the benefit of Western capitalism. Yet the Western powers pressed on with their plans. In early June 1947, US Secretary of State George C. Marshall announced that billions of dollars of US aid would soon be available to countries across Europe. This influx of capital was designed to spark a post-war recovery while opening up trade barriers. This measure aimed at securing Americans' dominance in the world's economy while helping to stop the spread of Soviet communism. The western zones of Germany became the third biggest recipient of American aid, behind only Britain and France. The Marshall Plan facilitated an economic recovery across Western Europe. And it wasn't long before the economic revival of Western Germany was accompanied with a political one. In 1947, the British authorities in Germany declared denazification to be complete. This, to be clear, was a political decision as the Cold War came to dominate British foreign policy. The impulse to continue this wholesale examination of German society and to pursue war crimes prosecutions quickly diminished. It marked a significant step towards the end of the military government and eventual handover of power to the Germans themselves. In January 1948, Britain's Foreign Minister Ernest Bevin unveiled a new policy for the future of Germany and Europe, the so-called Western Union. The idea was developed at the London Six Power Conference, the first session of which was held between the 23rd of February and 6th of March 1948. On the 17th of March, Britain, France, Belgium, Luxembourg and the Netherlands announced the Treaty of Brussels, which provided for the organization of military, economic, social and cultural cooperation among member states, as well, crucially, as a mutual defense clause. It was a precursor to the establishment of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, the following year with the inclusion of the US government. This major international decision was made without consulting the Soviets, who were excluded from the London Conference, meaning it was quite clearly in violation of Potsdam. In the Soviet Union, the news was denounced as the Western nations abandoning democratization of Germany in favor of preserving capitalism. By way of response, the head of the Soviet military occupation in Germany, Marshal Sokolovsky, walked out of the Allied Control Council in Berlin. On the 20th of April, the second session of the London Six Power Conference went ahead regardless. This meeting finalized plans for a new West German state to be known officially as the Federal Republic of Germany. It meant the fusion of the US, British and French zones into a single entity. The Western powers would maintain supervision over German industry through the International Authority of the Ruhr, complete with the last few unfinished demilitarization efforts, and of course would retain a military presence within the Federal Republic itself. Yet otherwise, the course was set for the creation of an independent, democratic, westward-looking West German state that would signal the end of the military occupation in the British, French, and American zones. That summer, British Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin rose in the House of Commons to deliver the news of this so-called London programme. It was clear, he suggested, that the occupying powers had failed to enact a common policy in Germany. The issue at hand was why. According to the Foreign Secretary, the blame lay squarely at the Soviet door. Having refused to adhere to the Potsdam Agreement on reparations, Stalin had forced the British to spend more than £200 million on food and raw materials for Germany since 1945. In Bevin's reading, it left the Western powers with no choice. To quote, "We could not leave this great Western area for which the United States, France, and ourselves are responsible as a slum, a great human slum, because all the resources capable of contributing to the standard of life, not only of Germany, but of Europe, were lying there unrehabilitated and unrestored. We had to do something." The Soviets, however, had a very different interpretation of events. In their view, the London programme was a rank violation of the Potsdam Agreement, and even more worryingly, perhaps an attempt to harness the military potential of Western Germany in a future war against the Soviet Union. As international tensions heightened, the threat of war was certainly on the minds of many. That March, British civilian administrator Mary Booman wrote home from Germany and reported to her parents how the political situation at the moment seems fraught with ominous possibilities. Soon enough, the Soviets announced the first restrictions on military and passenger traffic between the Western zones and Berlin. the city being shared among the four occupiers, but situated deep inside the Soviet zone. It was an attempt to pressure the Allies to retreat from their ambitious plans for the reconstruction of Western Germany. On the 1st of April at Helmstedt, just inside the British zone, Soviet guards halted 2 American trains headed for the German capital. They demanded to search the trains and check travellers' documents. Allied officers refused, and a standoff ensued. This was the beginning of the so-called April crisis, or Little Airlift, when Soviet officials made seemingly random alterations to the Allied access arrangements for Berlin, and in the process created occasional moments of chaos. The British immediately halted all train journeys and opted instead to bring passengers and supplies by air. In response, the Soviet Air Force began sporadically intercepting British planes mid-flight, flying intentionally close to impede their path, a tactic known to military pilots as buzzing. On the 5th of April, a British European Airways Viking aircraft was flying between London and Berlin with a stop in Hamburg. This was a commercial flight with 10 passengers and 4 crew on board, most of whom were civilians. As the airliner reached Berlin in the early afternoon, it descended to around 1,000 feet and made a gentle left-hand turn before preparing its landing gear for touchdown. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, a Soviet Yak-3 fighter aircraft appeared from behind and, according to eyewitnesses, dived beneath the passenger airline before climbing sharply. At the midpoint of this bold maneuver, the Yak's starboard wing clipped the port wing of the Viking, causing both to break off. The 2 planes crashed, and there were no survivors in what became known as the Gatow air disaster. It was the kind of accident that could easily have turned simmering tensions into all-out war. This was certainly on the minds of some back in London, including former Prime Minister Winston Churchill. According to the American ambassador, Britain's wartime leader was convinced that the US should exploit its monopoly over nuclear arms. He believes that now is the time promptly to tell the Soviets that if they do not retire from Berlin and abandon Eastern Germany, withdrawing to the Polish frontier, we will raze their cities. From the Americans came a more restrained but still potentially inflammatory plan to break through the Soviet blockade by force. The military governor of the US zone proposed an Anglo-American convoy of tanks, troops, and lorries push past the Soviet border guards on the roads into Berlin. Yet his British Army counterpart, Brian Robertson, warned that just a handful of Russian tanks could block their path or even instigate a shooting match that the exposed convoy of British and American soldiers would have little hope of winning. Instead, it was the British government who led the way in the developing crisis over Berlin. In the first place, Prime Minister Clement Attlee established 3 guiding principles: to maintain the Western position in the German capital, to keep the peace, and to hold firm with the implementation of the London programme. This approach ruled out abandoning Berlin, but also any acts of aggression that might start a war. It also limited the likelihood of successful negotiations, given that the Soviets were wholly committed to stopping the Western plans for the reconstruction of Germany. In the following weeks, as intermittent disruptions continued and both sides seemed no closer to compromise, the crisis gained momentum. British occupier Mary Booman wrote once more to her parents back in London, documenting the anxiety that stalked everyone in Germany. I suppose it is too much to expect to be able to live a decent, quiet existence in these times. In June 1948, events in Berlin escalated with unnerving speed. On the 16th, the Soviet representative walked out of the city's governing body. It was a piece of political theatre that signalled the resolve of the Soviets to stand firm. The following evening, British soldier Chris Howland was finishing his shift at the British Forces Network radio station in Hamburg when 2 British military policemen appeared. They handed him a sealed envelope and informed him that they would all be staying the night in the studio until the following morning, when he would be asked to read its contents over the radio at 6:30 in the morning. A rather bemused Howland waited all night and then announced to his audience news of a currency reform. The Deutsche Mark would become legal tender across the British, French, and American zones in just 3 days' time, rendering all previous currency invalid. This, it was hoped, would pave the way towards a more stable economy and assist ambitious reconstruction plans. The reform essentially wiped out all public and private debt overnight, as well as the black market that continued to undermine attempts at economic recovery. The currency reform was a provocative move that inevitably further angered the Soviets. They had not been informed of a change which risked a wave of inflation in the Soviet zone, where the old German currency remained legal tender. Over the course of the next few days, the Soviet authorities rushed to introduce a new currency of their own, known as the Ostmark. Even more significantly, the USSR instigated a series of retaliatory actions that came to a head on the 24th of June, when all railroad and water connections into Berlin from the western zones were entirely and conclusively cut. This was the beginning of the Berlin blockade. To regain access to the city, the Western Allies were invited to negotiate with the Soviet Union, who proposed the resumption of full power control over Germany in preparation for a new unified German government and the eventual withdrawal of the occupiers. As far as the British and Americans were concerned, this offer was a blatant attempt to undermine the Western Union and perhaps even usher in a communist Germany. The final hopes of a diplomatic solution seemed to be dashed. With American policymakers and military commanders undecided on the best course of action, it was again left to the British to spearhead the Western response. Foreign Secretary Bevan and his military advisors in the zone pushed for an ambitious airlift to supply not only the Western garrisons in Berlin, but the people of the city too. It was a monumental undertaking, something which had never been attempted at such a scale, and many feared it would inevitably fail. Yet without any obvious alternatives and few diplomatic channels still open, the British and Americans had to give it a go. On the 26th of June, the first transport aircraft carrying supplies for Berliners took off, and within days, schools of British troops and German civilians were put to work unloading the supplies. Foreign Secretary Bevan appeared in the House of Commons once again, where he defiantly announced to the cheers of both Labour and Conservative MPs that the British intended to maintain supply routes into the German capital. We recognise that as a result of these decisions, a grave situation might arise, he warned. Should such a situation arise, we shall ask the House to face it. His Majesty's government and the Western Allies can see no alternative between that and surrender, and none of us can accept surrender. A few days later, British Administrator Mary Booman wrote a letter from the British zone once more, the tone of her correspondence growing more anxious by the day. Most people seem to think that there will be a showdown in the not-too-distant future. Remarkably, all-out war was averted. Rather, in the course of the next 13 months, thousands of British, American, and German men and women worked around the clock to supply the western sectors of Berlin by air. In raw terms, it was an astonishing achievement. More than 266,000 flights brought 2.25 million tons of supplies of food, fuel, newsprint, and more. By the summer of 1949, a plane was landing or taking off every 60 seconds, and more than 8,000 tons of supplies were brought in each day to cater for the city's inhabitants. The Berlin airlift was a great victory for the Western powers, especially in public relation terms. The British and Americans had stood firm in the face of apparent Soviet aggression. For Britain, America, and France, the plan in Germany was now clear. Their focus shifted to the Cold War and the implementation of the London Programme. A new West German state would soon come into being, a political and economic barrier against the Soviet Union. Its creation represented a complete shift in thinking about Germany from the end of the Second World War. In 1945, Germany, an opponent in two world wars, had been condemned in Britain as a destructive force at the heart of Europe. But now, only a few years later, West Germany was suddenly hailed as an ally in the fight against the Soviets. On the 12th of May 1949, just days after the Berlin blockade came to an end, West Germany's new constitution, known as the Basic Law, was ratified and became law 11 days later. From that point, all eyes turned to the first democratic election campaign in Germany since the 1930s. The Federal Republic would test its new form of parliamentary democracy. On the 15th of September 1949, Comrade Adenauer was nominated as the first Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany, a position he would hold until 1963. It heralded a new political age for a new state. A week later, British, French, and American military governors were replaced by high commissioners, essentially ending the post-war military occupation. In November 1949, the city of Bonn was chosen as West Germany's capital city. This was a small, sleepy municipality on the River Rhine that many felt inadequate for the task. But it was selected precisely because of a new German political trend, impermanence. By avoiding a major city like Frankfurt, West German politicians were living in the hope that their entire country would be united in the near future, with Berlin restored to its former glory as capital. In hindsight, however, this would not come to pass for some decades. In October 1949, the creation of another sovereign nation, the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany, in the former Soviet zone, struck a formal division between East and West Germany that would endure for the next 40 years. This brief history of the Allied occupation of Germany in the aftermath of the Second World War shows us a few key things. Firstly, that this was an extremely challenging time. Europe emerged from the war in chaos, with widespread hunger and deprivation, devastation, and shortages felt across the entire continent. For many people, the traumas of war did not simply end in May 1945. Secondly, in this difficult situation, the ideological and strategic differences of the wartime allies became ever more apparent, specifically the division between the capitalist powers of the West and the communist Soviet Union. Over only a few years, the plans made in 1945 regarding Germany fell apart, ushering in the Cold War and the division of Europe between East and West. Finally, as I tried to emphasize today, this is a history in which Britain and the British Army played a hugely significant role. It was Britain's relative weakness, coupled with what they regarded as the Soviet Union's stubbornness, that forced British politicians to push for a new plan in Germany. It was also the British government who found solutions to the blockade of Berlin, avoiding all-out war without compromising plans for the creation of West Germany. The British, through a combination of diplomacy and anti-Soviet bravado, had navigated a way through the assorted crises of the late 1940s. In the 1950s, Britain was destined to take a step back as America and the Soviet Union confronted one another across the continent and soon the entire world. British troops nevertheless remained on deployment in Germany for another 70 years prior to their final withdrawal in 2019. Their presence on bases across northwest Germany was the last vestige of the military occupation, a brief but historic period that oversaw a transition from the Second World War to the beginnings of the Cold War. Thank you.